Next, a look at the media's relationship with whistleblowers. Speakers include journalists from NBC News and the CBS program 60 Minutes. The National Whistleblowers Legal Defense and Education Fund hosts this nearly 2-hour event.
Welcome. On behalf of the National Whistleblower Center, my name is Stephen Cohn, the Executive Director, and I'd like to welcome you to our seminar on whistleblowers and the news media. With me today are 3 distinguished journalists who have collectively probably 75 years of doing high-quality journalism and working with whistleblowers. Rich Bonin from CBS 60 Minutes, John Solomon, who is a distinguished print investigative journalist for many, many years with The Post, former executive director of Washington Times with the AP, and Jim Popkin, who worked, as I know him, mostly through NBC Nightly News, where he again worked extensively with sources and whistleblowers. And they'll have more extensive introductions when I call upon them. I've represented whistleblowers since 1984, and I've been working with the press ever since. As when it's my turn to speak, many whistleblower cases are actually either won in the press, where the employer or the government agency backs down, or at least the whistleblower can get a sense of vindication by having their issues resolved and called to public attention. So whistleblowers have worked with news media from the beginning of the Republic, and I hope continue to work with the news media and that the association is as successful as it can be. Our first speaker is Rich Bonin, a producer for 60 Minutes. We're extremely honored to have him here. For 22 years, he's been a producer at the award-winning show 60 Minutes. That show needs no introduction. It's a preeminent news magazine. He has won awards for journalism, including 5 Emmy Awards. He's covered a wide range of stories on terrorism, the Middle East, and exposés about government and corporate misconduct. He did an extensive show and an investigation on the botched FBI anthrax investigation concerning Stephen Hatfield. He worked on the case showing how the FBI pursued the wrong man in the Robert Hansen espionage case. He did extensive interviews and worked with Richard Clarke, the former top counterterrorism aide, in blowing the whistle on failures in the counterterrorism program. He's worked with corporate whistleblowers, including Chuck Hamill, and a campaign to silence him as he was blowing the whistle on oil companies. He's currently working on a book about Mr. Chalabi from Iraq, which is expected to be published next year by Doubleday. It's a true honor to have Mr. Bonin here, and I can tell you straight up that many, many whistleblowers that we've worked with have worked successfully with 60 Minutes, and it is a premier program, and we're truly honored to have him here. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. So, as you heard, I've actually been at 60 Minutes since 1984, so it's about 25 years now, and the 2 things I've learned or see most consistently about whistleblowers in all those years is, one, that they're sometimes often difficult, gruff, persnickety kind of personalities, but that trait is precisely what makes them whistleblowers. They're not willing to go along to go along. They're willing to buck the trend and speak out. And the other thing I've learned about whistleblowers is that almost always they're motivated by altruism. They want to act in a way that they see as in the public good or in the interest of national security, or to honor some higher principle that maybe the country stands for. And as I said, almost always that has been the personality trait that I've encountered. And one of the best examples of that is Dick Clark. He was President Bush's top counterterrorism advisor before, during, and after the 9/11 attacks. And as you all know, he was the guy who was telling everybody that bin Laden and al-Qaeda was targeting the U.S., and meanwhile the Bush administration wasn't taking it seriously. Paul Wolfowitz, Condi Rice, nobody was heeding his or George Tenet's calls to action, so to speak. And then Dick and I were talking about it as it was all unfolding, and it was all off the record, and I couldn't report it. But there came a time when he wanted to go public. He was, the dilemma for him was, when you work for the President of the United States, your loyalty is to the President. You are there to represent his interests, and that's something that Dick, like all executive office workers, take very seriously. But he felt this higher calling, that the administration was trying to blame Iraq for the 9/11 attacks in order to justify invading Iraq. And he didn't believe that, and he had to choose between his loyalty to the President and his sense of duty to the country. And I know he was motivated by a sense of duty, because I saw a high school yearbook that he wrote when he was a teenager, and he said, may the seventh ring of hell be reserved for those who remain silent when it's their time to come forward. I mean, this was something that was central to Dick's character. And the other thing he had to weigh is, when you take on the president, and you take on the government, you are going to be dealing with a ferocious counterattack, political, personal, potentially legal. It's a real tough decision. And also, in my experience, it's almost always, if you're motivated by this higher calling, it's almost always better to run into the spotlight, the glare of the news media, than remain in the shadows and just complaining about it internally. Because by going public, it inoculates you in many ways to retaliation. If it doesn't inoculate you from being fired, it can inoculate you, and often does, in terms of holding up your credibility and the quality of your character in the counterattacks that are going to come. And Dick had already made the decision to quit the White House, so he wasn't worried about losing his job, but credibility was a big issue. And so he came to us with, unbelievable information. And Dick is a highly credible source, but as my colleagues will tell you, you never go to broadcast or print with just one source. You have to verify things, especially when you're taking on the president. And so one of the things Dick told us was that right after 9/11, the president pulled him into a little room on the side outside the Oval Office, and Dick was already saying this is a signature al-Qaeda attack, and the president told Dick, "No, Saddam. I want Saddam. Give me Saddam." Dick felt like the president was pressuring him to jerry-rig the investigation and the evidence so that they could pin it on Saddam. So now this is Dick in a private meeting with the president. Do you take Dick's word? Well, fortunately, there were several other people in the room, and we were able to get them to verify off camera Dick's version of events. So when we then interviewed Stephen Hadley for the piece, and he didn't exactly deny it. It was a classic non-denial denial. He said, well, there's no meeting, there's no record of such a meeting. I mean, that's not saying the meeting didn't occur. And, and we told, Leslie Stahl is the correspondent I work with, and she, in all honesty, ate him alive on that and a number of other things. And for the next week, Condoleezza Rice was saying publicly there's no record of such a meeting and denying it and attempting to attack Dick's credibility. And I think 5 to 7 days later, some of our confidential sources then decided to go forward and go public and say, yep, I was there and Dick is telling the truth. And the point is, and right after our piece, which was a two-parter, so it was, about 30 minutes, which is unusual in itself, but right after our piece, the 9/11 hearings occurred, and Dick followed up our piece with his testimony. And what he did is frame the debate. What he did was establish his credibility. I mean, one thing that TV news can often do very well is let the viewers look you in the eye. It's a tight 60-minute shot, and you can get a feel if this person is credible or not. So you were defining yourself before those whom you were attacking or criticizing are going to come out and attack you with all sorts of leaks and innuendo and what have you. And I know for a fact Dick did not regret for a minute going on 60 Minutes, and that it was a really smart move. So, to me, that anecdote, illustrates, both the virtue of going public if you're a whistleblower. I mean, it's a very personal decision, and it's never going to be easy, but there are benefits to going public. It also demonstrates the values that the whistleblower weighs in him or herself. Duty to president, duty to the truth, to getting to a higher calling, about the cause, what was behind 9/11. And in many ways, the networks also face that same dilemma. Our sister broadcast, 60 Minutes 2, which is no longer on the air, when Abu Ghraib came to them, the Pentagon lobbied very heavily against that story being broadcast and made an argument that everyone in the news business and at CBS News and 60 Minutes cares about, and that is that piece would inflame anti-American sentiments among the Iraqis and among the Al-Qaeda in Iraq characters, and that it could jeopardize soldiers. And that was a very compelling concern. And I think, the broadcast mulled it over for a couple of weeks. And in the end, you have to weigh it against another duty, which is, here 60 Minutes 2 had documented evidence that some of our people were doing things that were so awful that even in times of war, they're prohibited by the rules of war. And so what do you do? It's a very tough decision that you weigh. And obviously in the end, for competitive reasons and for that reason, they went with the piece. There are instances where we've had really good stories that we haven't run because in the end, the government's argument may it may not be an Abu Ghraib situation. It's a nifty story, but running it may compromise something that the story in and of itself isn't worth doing. And that's happened to me, and we won't run with it. But in any event, those are to me, the crux of the issues that whistleblowers and reporters alike have to grapple with, and I guess finally, I would say, in terms of what we're looking for, are stories of consequence, that go to the heart of what we stand for as a country, or go to the heart of what an administration stands for, and whether there is an important level of hypocrisy or deceit that needs to be exposed. So that would be the extent of my remarks, and I pass it over to you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker, and again, we're going to do the opening remarks, and then there'll be questions and answers, and I have a number of questions now already, is Mr. Jim Popkin, former senior investigative producer for NBC Nightly News, and the founder of Seven Oaks Media Group, where he's now the executive. Before I read his formal bio, we've worked with him for many years, and he did some very, very important breaking news items through Nightly News of Whistleblowers, and always did an extremely credible, effective, and balanced job. And it was just good to know that there were producers who were interested not only in the story, but also in protecting the whistleblower and getting hard and sometimes controversial news out there. Jim worked at several senior positions for NBC News over a 14-year period. He was a senior investigative producer and oversaw a team of correspondents and producers that broke major stories for NBC News on politics, Wall Street scandals, defense intelligence scandals, and law enforcement controversies. He was an on-air correspondent, and his stories appeared on NBC Today's Show, The Weekend Nightly News, CNBC, MSNBC. Mr. Popkin has won 4 National Emmy Awards for Outstanding Journalism, 2 Edward Murrow Awards, and was a finalist for the National Magazine Award. The American Journalism Review profiled him as one of Washington's most enterprising journalists. He is now, as I said, the founder of a media consulting group known as Seven Oaks Media Group. And it's my honor to have Jim here, and I'm looking forward to his remarks.
Thank you, Steve. Despite Steve's kind words today, I thought I'd be a little contrarian in talking about whistleblowers. In preparing for today, I was thinking back. I was a journalist for 25 years, about 25 years, and during that time, I probably produced or reported on a couple of dozen stories that involve whistleblowers. But in the same period, I interviewed and talked to and ultimately declined to do stories on probably 2 or 3 times the number of people who I ultimately did report on. So why was I selective? Despite being in these, this hallowed area of the National Whistleblower Center, the truth is, as Rich alluded to, whistleblowers can be really difficult people. They can be a huge pain in the neck, and I'm not saying that lightly. There are a lot of reasons why that enter into the calculation of whether you could or should go ahead with a story. First of all, they all have, by their very nature, an axe to grind. They're trying to get their own story out. Many of them have an inflated sense of what they want to break or their own value to the organizations that they're now reporting on. So today I thought I'd talk about kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly of whistleblowers and end with a couple of war stories. Whistleblowers are not truly sources per se. Generally, they are people who've worked inside a government agency or a corporation, and they're desperate to tell their stories and go on the record, on camera in my case, to often defy their bosses, disappoint, and in some cases even betray their colleagues to tell the world about some alleged wrongdoing. I obviously appreciate what they do and the risks that they take, and I'm proud of the stories that I've worked on regarding them. But as a journalist, it's often a very difficult process. Rich and John and I were talking before we got here, and Rich made a good point, which is that when you first approach a whistleblower, you end up spending almost all your time trying to discredit and disprove what this person is bringing to you. And that's for the ultimate purpose of then, if you believe in them and they're credible, of then trying to prove and push out their story. But you need to spend that time up front in trying to almost knock down, almost in the way that a lawyer would in a deposition, what they're about to say, because you have to anticipate that that's what is going to happen on the back end once you do the reporting. So you need to be very conscious going in about the negative aspects of their story. But just on personalities for a second, and this is not entirely a trivial concern, but whistleblowers, as I said, are often difficult people. First of all, generally when I would meet them, they feel persecuted, hated, or ignored by their own organization, and there's a certain therapy element to dealing with them. And I'm sure Steve can talk about that because he has to deal with them day after day, sometimes for years. They're often not used to feeling like outcasts in their own organizations, and the pressure on them can be really intense. Some of them start to imagine conspiracies and threats, and it leads to often a difficult situation up front. In addition, many of these folks often are kind of perfectionists by nature. And in my experience, some of them almost obsessively follow the rules, and then they're just so disappointed when people around them don't treat the rules in the same fashion. So it's the job of the reporter to determine how big of a deal their grievances are, because in some cases they might be petty. They may be right. Someone may have violated a rule, but it may not be that consequential. So that's part of the process of ferreting out whether you want to move forward. Secondly, as I mentioned, you have to deal with the issue of possible skeletons in the closet. So you can anticipate that an organization, in Rich's case, a White House, is going to push back and push back hard. And they're going to look for any negative thing that they can find to discredit that whistleblower. And they have all the resources imaginable because they have the employee records. In many cases, a corporation or an organization or a government agency is not supposed to reveal that information. A lot of times it's covered under the Privacy Act. But trust me, they will manage to find a way to get the information out. It may not be done overtly, but the information will get out. And consequently, you've got to start and do this forensic work on your own almost immediately as you begin hearing the story. It's just so important up front. You don't want to be surprised later to learn about something that may not even really be connected to the main issue. But for instance, if there's an old lawsuit or a bankruptcy or something that's embarrassing, it may have a bearing on what you're reporting. And to some degree, you are taking on, by airing their story or doing a report, to some degree, you're taking on their own account. You are kind of owning it. And you have to be comfortable with that and all the aspects of a person's background and personality. Finally, kind of the three big buckets here, big picture items. There's the not so little issue of the truth. Whistleblowers, their stories need to be evaluated carefully, obviously, because just think about it. Their jobs are on the line, their reputations, and they also have, in many cases, have a possible financial gain at stake. And I'm hoping that Steve will talk about that in the litigation. I wasn't really ever aware of that. I wouldn't really pursue that, but I had to be mindful that there was some financial benefit for these people coming forward. And all that means is, in the same way any reporter always has to assess the credibility of a source or person they're interviewing, you just have to be that much more on guard for all of those reasons. The other issue that is just kind of intrinsic with all this is that oftentimes the alleged bad behavior that the whistleblower is talking about has taken place behind closed doors. And I mean, obviously there might be an audit trail, there might be documents, but many times they're talking about information that maybe only one or two other people know about. And, that just creates a situation where you need to be doubly, triply cognizant of this and just try to do a better, even better job in reporting. So those are kind of some of the pitfalls, if you will, of dealing with whistleblowers. Now, just for the good part, I guess. As Rich has said, I consider whistleblowers, many of them, to be real heroes, in some cases patriots, who help expose evil and wrongdoing in our country. And I'm thinking of, with 60 Minutes, Dick Clark, Jeffrey Wigand, the tobacco case, Daniel Ellsberg with the Pentagon Papers, and so many more. In my own career, I haven't had any of those big ticket items, but I have worked on some stories that I still think are important. Steve mentioned Bunny Greenhouse. Those of you who don't know Bunny, she was a procurement official in the Pentagon who came to NBC News, and I worked primarily with Lisa Myers at NBC, and told us that her colleagues, other federal contracting officials, had bent the rules regarding handing out contracts to Halliburton. And wow, I don't know if you remember, Bunny was so nervous during that interview. Our first tape, we rolled a 20-minute beta tape. We never used one sentence from it. She just was so nervous, and she had never been in this position before of, essentially talking out of school regarding what had happened with her former employers. But she warmed up and she did a great interview. But she suffered as a result. It was very, very hard for her. Another former government employee we interviewed is a woman named Jane Turner. Jane was an FBI agent. She came to us and told us that during the cleanup at 9/11 at Ground Zero, FBI agents had repeatedly removed rubble and artifacts that they then handed out as souvenirs to their friends and family. On its face, it doesn't sound like that terrible of a crime, but we went and talked to 9/11 families, and they were just so stunned. They consider Ground Zero, really to be a grave site, and they were horrified by this behavior. Jane pointed it out, and she was vilified within the FBI. They came up against her very hard and really tried to smear her despite a really good track record as an employee. A federal court ultimately rewarded her with $1.4 million for the retaliation that she suffered and also back pay. And finally, we interviewed Bassem Youssef, who was and is, I guess still probably today, the highest-ranking Arab-American FBI agent. Bassem also had never done an interview, and he went on camera to tell us that in his estimation, the FBI was very, very poorly educated about radical Islam. And this is someone who had worked on, prior to 9/11, all the major terrorism cases and was really considered an expert. After 9/11, for a variety of reasons, he wasn't used in that capacity. And in the interview, he said that the FBI wasn't doing everything that it could do to combat terrorism, and that when it was involved, and obviously the FBI is involved, it was doing it in a kind of haphazard and ignorant fashion. And then he also talked about how he personally had been discriminated against after 9/11. And I just want to read, as part of this story, Steve was allowed to depose a number of senior FBI officials. We ended up doing this story using the interview with Bassem, but as a kind of side benefit to doing this story, we were given access to videotape depositions of senior FBI officials talking about their knowledge of terrorism. And Steve was able to depose Dale Watson, who was the top FBI counterterrorism official both before and then after 9/11. And I've known Dale for years and always held him in high regard as a counterterrorism official. But I'll just read you this exchange because it sure surprised me. Steve asked, quote, "Do you know who Osama bin Laden's spiritual advisor was?" Dale Watson: "Can't recall." Steve: "And do you know the differences in the religion between Shiite and Sunni Muslims?" "Not technically, no." So again, this is not the Pentagon Papers or even a case like Rich and taking on the White House, but I thought it was important. And our access to this whistleblower gave us access to these videotapes and shed some light on what was going on in the FBI at a critical moment. And none of this could have been revealed without a courageous whistleblower. So just in closing, I want to say, just to wrap up, I guess, they can be very difficult, but it's worth it. It's worth the effort that you have to put into it because they can produce some of the most meaningful stories, and they're good for our democracy.
Thank you very much. And I just want to say one thing. I very much appreciate Jim's remarks because for the whistleblowers who are listening to this and who will be listening to this, it's extremely important to understand, how the press views you, what you need to do in order to have a credible presentation. And I think Jim's very, very straightforward analysis of that is really helpful, and I really take my hat off and thank you for those words. Our next speaker is John Solomon. I've known John for a number of years. I consider him the dean of print investigative journalism in Washington, D.C., bar none. I've always said that for an investigative journalist, there's kind of like a bug. There's something there that this journalist wants to get to the truth and the root of the story, no matter what, and charge. And from a whistleblower perspective, that's who you want on your case. I think for any investigative journalist, that's the character trait that makes someone into a top-notch, world-renowned, successful investigative journalist. But for a whistleblower, that's what you need. John has done just outstanding stories, both in cases that we've worked with him on, but also just watching the stories he's done. It's an absolute honor to have him here. In his formal biography, he's the former executive editor of the Washington Times and currently a former current special correspondent for the Washington Post, I know focusing on investigative stories. And he's with the Packard Media Group right now. He left the Washington Times a couple months ago. John is an award-winning investigative journalist. As the former executive editor of the Washington Times, he won numerous journalism awards, including the Robert Kennedy Journalism Award in 2008, the Society of Professional Journalists 2009 National Public Service Award. He also produced the first joint project with CBS 60 Minutes, which exposed how the FBI crime lab practiced faulty bullet-lead analysis for decades, using erroneous science to convict hundreds of people without informing them of those problems. The series won the 2008 Robert Kennedy Memorial Journalism Award for domestic television and the Society of Professional Journalists Top Award for investigative TV reporting. Before joining the Washington Post, Mr. Solomon spent 20 years as a manager and reporter for the Associated Press, where he won the Grammy Achievement Award for coordinating wire services worldwide investigative coverage of the 9/11 attacks. Mr. Solomon was named in 2005 to oversee a 7-member investigative team dedicated to producing high-impact stories that could play simultaneously on TV, on the web, in radio and in print. The team's work included exposing the Dubai Ports World deal, exposing ethical missteps among several leaders of Congress, and exposing the now infamous Hurricane Katrina videotape showing what President Bush had been told before the deadly storm. Before creating the team, Mr. Solomon spent 6 years overseeing the administration, personnel, and finances of AP's 150-member Washington Bureau as the Assistant Bureau Chief. In that role, he oversaw AP's relationship with major newspapers in the metropolitan area. Today, Mr. Solomon is with the Packard Media Group. He also is actively engaged still in doing top-notch investigative journalism. It's my honor to have Mr. Solomon here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me here, and it's a great pleasure to be alongside Jim and Rich, who I've admired throughout my career for doing the type of journalism that they've committed time and time again. And I've known throughout my career that whistleblowers have been an important part of my career, but I didn't really understand how important until about a year ago. A young graduate student from St. Louis University, I think it was, called me and said, did you know you did 377 stories that involved whistleblowers? And I said, no, that's not possible. And she counted them up and sent me a stack, and her math was pretty good, I guess. But over the course of 25 years, I've interacted with whistleblowers almost weekly. And for every story I've written, just like Jim said and Rich said, there's probably 3 that I passed on because I couldn't validate or verify or trust the information. So it's a hit and miss proposition, but the value of what whistleblowers do when they stand forward and they bring wrongdoing to the public's attention is essential to our democracy. And I think journalists, when they play the facilitating role, add to that process and bring value to it, and vetting what's right, what's wrong, and giving the public some accountability. My very first whistleblower that I encountered, I was about 19 years old. I was working on a wire desk in Wisconsin, and a person called up and said, hey, there's a big professional fight in Madison, and the boxer only can see out of one eye, and they're hiding it. In fact, he was rejected for a boxing license in Las Vegas, and so I called Las Vegas, got the boxing license. Sure enough, he was blind in one eye, and we exposed the fact that Wisconsin was a lot willing to let a boxer with one eye, a vision, try to get in the ring when everyone else had rejected him. And I thought, well, this whistleblower thing is pretty easy. Someone calls up, you go check it out, and you have a story. And a few months later, I turned 20 and graduated from college, and another person called a teacher and said, you know, all across Wisconsin there are teachers who've been convicted of molesting children, and they move to another school district and they just start teaching again. You really ought to look into it. And we started a project, and sure enough, we found 370 teachers that had molested children and just moved to another district and started teaching again because there was no screening system. And again, I thought, wow, this is really great, this whistleblowing thing. I can get into this. And then I came to Washington, and I realized, wow, whistleblowing is a much more complicated and dark and tricky proposition. And the first whistleblowers I met here in Washington called me up. I was only here about 6 months. I still hadn't figured out the subway system, and I kept getting lost every day on the routes. And this person called and said, I've been watching what you've been reporting, and I need you to meet me at Lafayette Park at 6:30 in the morning tomorrow, and I'll be wearing X, and I'm going to leave a newspaper behind, and you should pick it up. So I'm nuts. My wife thought I was nuts, and I went at 6 o'clock in the morning, and there were several homeless folks there, and I'm trying to find the guy that was a little better dressed, and there he was. And the second I got near the bench, he walked off. And there was a copy of the Washington Post folded in half, and inside there was a little hand-scribbled note that said, I just broke the law by giving this to you, but you should read it. And there was a federal document, a classified federal document, and that began my relationship with whistleblowers in Washington, where life is so much more complicated, where the risks and the legal consequences of whistleblowing are much greater. And for the last 20 years, I've really become to appreciate the complexities of the relationship that a great lawyer may have, a whistleblower has, and then we in the media have. And I left on everyone's chair here some 7 principles that I won't go through each of them today, but I'd like to mention 2 things and echo some things that Rich and Jim said, because they're spot on. First off, whistleblowing coverage in the media is the most humanizing experience, one of the most humanizing experiences you'll have as a reporter. The range of emotions, the range of motives, the range of pressures that a whistleblower faces over the course of their whistleblowing process can really complicate the communication process. I've seen whistleblowers who suffered from severe depression, from paranoia, from just post-traumatic stress disorder in one case. And the ability to get an accurate story is complicated by the things that they endure every day, the unbelievable pressure, the unbelievable isolation that they sometimes endure when they step forward and their colleagues back away from them and leave them in complete isolation. And so over the years, I've tried to develop some principles that guided my reporting to make sure at the end of the day that I serve the whistleblower and the public with the same quality of journalism. And those are on the sheet today. I'm just going to mention a couple because I think they're important to understanding the context in which whistleblowing journalism occurs in the 21st century. The first one is I've seen in many cases, and I've firmly come to believe that the court of public opinion may be just as important as the court of law for whistleblowers. And that's not usually the case in most legal cases where issues are being fought out. But oftentimes, whistleblowers seek in the court of public opinion protections that they may not be able to get under the weak laws that our government provides our whistleblowers with today. So anyone who's going to represent a whistleblower, any whistleblower who's going to step forward, any journalist who's going to engage them, needs to have some principles to deal with each other. But the first principle is you have to be ready as a whistleblower and as their representative to engage the court of public opinion and understand the rules, the pressures of what journalists do when they come together. The second thing is when you start that relationship, it is essential, as Newt Gingrich's mother might now remember, to set the terms of the conversation. If you remember, Connie Chung said, "Between you and me," and I guess Mrs. Gingrich thought that meant this wasn't going to be on camera, and of course it was on camera. It's important to understand the four terms by which you can talk to journalists. On the record, everything you say can and will be used on the record from you with your name attached to it, and once it's gone, there's no taking it back. On background, and this is an important one because the description that you as a source, if you're a whistleblower and you're not using your name, but you're providing information, you want to step forward at the beginning with the journalist and make sure you get the identity, your description right. Because if I describe you too accurately or too precisely, you may get in trouble. If I describe you too inaccurately, I'm going to get the public in trouble and disserve the public. We had a great example of that when Scooter Libby tried to be called a congressional source because he had worked there 20 years before when in the Judy Miller case. And so it's important for me to be accurate. Getting that description of an anonymous source, a source on background, is essential. There's a thing called deep background, which is even a more vague description of you. And then off the record, and this is an important one to understand, if you tell me something off the record, I can't use it because it came from you, but don't think it doesn't inform my reporting. I'm going to go try to find out what that's about. And so understand that a journalist, when you talk off the record, they're not going to quote you, they can't, but if they can find another way to get that information, they almost certainly will. And it's important to understand those four terms because they guide the relationship going forward and they build the sense of trust that each side has once they understand the conversation. The third element is trust. You have to be able to build a relationship of trust. I've had whistleblowers that when we ended a series of stories actually said they felt like they were getting divorced from me because we had spent more time with each other than we had spent with our wives and our kids. You spend an enormous amount of time getting to know the person, getting to know their pressures, their peculiarities, and you have to build trust. And one of the things a journalist does to build trust is to constantly verify information. When something comes in from the whistleblower and it isn't quite right and you go back to them, you have to be able to have a candid conversation. Hey, that doesn't seem to check out. That relationship of trust is what protects the public's interest in making sure what we report ultimately is accurate and precise and fair and balanced. At the end of the day, if you're a whistleblower or a lawyer representing a whistleblower, there's really only one thing journalists want more than anything else: facts, accurate facts, new facts. So when you're dealing with a media person and you're trying to get a story across, know that we deal in the realm of facts. We're not interested in opinion and scuttlebutt, although sometimes it makes for a good beer after hours. But what you really want is facts. And so the factual relaying of information back and forth not only builds the relationship of trust that we just talked about, it ensures that when the story ultimately comes out, the public has a factual record, a factual basis to make a judgment about the allegations and the wrongdoing that may be there. The fifth thing is it is entirely a danger to step forward as a whistleblower because as you become more isolated, as you face more pressures, the allure of the media light, the cameras, the town cars that pick you up and take you to dinner to meet a famous TV correspondent can become intoxicating. And it's easy sometimes to begin to get caught up in that intoxication of the media limelight. So it's important for lawyers, the journalist, and the whistleblower to understand that that's a danger. I've seen whistleblowers who got too engaged in the excitement and all the attention they were getting and begun to stray off course on the factual accuracy of their story. It's easy to do when people are trying to wine and dine you. And so I think that's an important factor. And for us as journalists, it's very important. 6, there are many different ways to get information conveyed to a journalist. And as someone who has faced the consequences of reporting information that was classified or that someone didn't want out, we have learned that there are many different ways that a lawyer or a whistleblower who may be constrained about talking about something, there may be a gag order, a subpoena, grand jury subpoena, grand jury secrecy rules that prevent them from talking, and yet there are ways to point journalists to information, those facts, those things that we're looking for, stubborn facts, that don't violate any of those terms and yet guide the reporter there. Hey, have you looked at the briefings in the court case recently? Have you checked on the contract database lately, like maybe in the last 3 months? Little tidbits that keep us straight, give us facts, and guide us to a story even while one may be remaining true to their oaths and their secrecy obligations. And then finally, because of the pressures and the range of emotions that a whistleblower goes through, I have found repeatedly at the end of a process when a reporter does a thing called fair comment process, when you go get the other side of the story, oftentimes whistleblowers feel this moment of betrayal. You're talking to the other side. Why would you do that? Well, because we need to have both sides of a story. We need to ensure at the end of the day that what you've told us is accurate, because it doesn't serve your case in the court of public opinion if I get something wrong and if I don't have a balanced story that someone won't believe or treat as fair. And so those 7 principles have sort of guided my my relationship with whistleblowers. And I think as the art of whistleblowing becomes more increasingly dangerous with the fewer and fewer legal protections that whistleblowers have for stepping forward, having a sense of how to work with the media in the court of public opinion, I think is becoming more and more important. So that's what I've...
Thank you. I really want to thank you, John, for that. And I can say that, and he did cover all of his principles, which I'm happy with, because I was going to ask him to cover them if he had, and I was checking them off one by one. And I'm going to give the last presentation, and this is from an attorney's perspective who represents whistleblowers. First, I'd like to say that, and I hope in the questions and answers more of this comes out, one of the very first cases that I won, and I actually counseled this with my brother Mike Cohn back in between 86 and 87, we actually won it in the press, literally. It was a case of an atomic weapons whistleblower at Savannah River site, Roger Wenzel, a great guy, and he blew the whistle on illegal drug use and some major safety issues in the construction of atomic weapons. And he was the first major national whistleblower at an atomic weapons site concerning health and safety. And what we learned very quickly was that the law for atomic safety excluded the weapons industry, so he had no rights. But he had an extremely interesting story and a lot of credibility. So we took it to, it was a journalist with the Washington Post, Cass Peterson, and she ran a really good story about his case. It was on page 3, excellent story. We weren't going to win anything, but the contractor overreacted and fired his #1 witness. So the firing of the witness then became a page 1 story in the Washington Post, and then continued coverage because of how just outrageous the contractor reacted to the story. So then the journalist confronted the Secretary of Energy at a press conference about what the Secretary of Energy was doing, which triggered an Inspector General investigation that eventually ordered the whistleblowers all to be reinstated with back pay. And I say this is, how do we know it was won in the press? Because Mike Cohn went down to a hearing in South Carolina for the whistleblowers. But the hearing was absolute sham because there were no real legal rights. So Mike went into it and he said, we want due process. We will not participate in a hearing without due process. And the hearing examiner said, well, this is our hearing. We're going to run the rules as we want to run it. Would you please have your whistleblower come in and tell us what happened to her? And Mike said, no, goodbye. He got up and left. So the whistleblowers never showed up at their own hearing, yet we won the case. Okay, that's a true story. They got reinstatement back pay because of the public pressure. And I will also state on the record that even if it's not winning a case, and that's the exception to the rule, I must say, don't think you're going to win your case that way, it can put pressure on an intelligent employer or government agency to back off. Because it's pretty much what Jim Popkins said, for the press to actually run a story, they will do and should do an extensive review and investigation. They have to check the credibility, the facts. They have to play the devil's advocate, and the whistleblower has to participate in that process. You know, you got to give them the good, the bad, and the ugly. You got to show them all the warts, all the weaknesses, and because if you can't essentially win your case with a journalist, you're not going to win it in court anyway, or you're going to have a tough time. So the journalist has to do their job, but once they run the story and stand behind, ultimately, those allegations, either implicitly or explicitly, but they viewed it as newsworthy, that can actually save the job of a whistleblower. Especially, unlike the contractors at Savannah River, if they realize that the reason it's in the press is because there's probably a lot of issues here they should be dealing with instead of firing and shooting the messenger. There's a second point I want to make, which I think is often lost. In the United States, I like to say this, we know there's no major, large whistleblower law, and that we often think that whistleblowers lack protections. But what I like to state is, I just got information. Believe it or not, Congress met in session, this is true, and passed a sweeping whistleblower law covering and protecting Americans to blow the whistle to the press. They did it unanimously, and they had such faith in our system, they presented it to all the states to back it up too, and 3/4 did it very quickly, and they all signed on. It's called the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, the #1 whistleblower law in the world, and in our country, the #1 whistleblower law. Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or press. That is the law of the land. And in 1968, the U.S. Supreme Court found that if you are a whistleblower working for the government and you blow the whistle to the press, you have constitutional protections and cannot be fired or retaliated against. Now, the gap between that constitutional principle and even those decisions and the reality is like the Grand Canyon. Only a twisted lawyer loving the difficult arguments would think it's as beautiful as the Grand Canyon. But the gap is as wide as the Grand Canyon. The right and the implementation of that right. You literally have to hike down and hike all the way back up and hope you have enough water and you're well supplied. Because there is a right, but if you think that right's just going to come to you because the Founding Fathers wrote it in an important document, you are not living in the United States of America today. Their retaliation is the norm. Government officials who swear an allegiance to the Constitution forgot about the First Amendment, period. That's the reality. But because those rights exist, you will be surprised how far you can go. For example, in 1995, we surprised a significant sector of the national news media and most lawyers in Washington when we had an active duty FBI agent with top secret clearances that were so top secret he could not tell me what the clearances were, who was responsible for managing the crime scene in the first terrorist attack on the World Trade Center, who had detailed information about the Oklahoma City bombing case, and who was a supervisory agent within the FBI working there on those cases. And we asserted his First Amendment rights and eventually got permission for him to speak on television, criticizing the FBI on those terrorist cases and keep his job. Why? Because when push comes to shove, the First Amendment actually does exist. And it may take, you have to go to court, you may have to get an injunction, but there is such a thing as the First Amendment, and it does apply. How many government officials have the audacity to assert those rights publicly? Very few. You can probably count them on your hands. And that's a shame, because the public right to know is harmed. In the private sector, most courts will view blowing the whistle to the news media as a protected activity and try to get to get protection under statutes. Unfortunately, just recently, in February of 2010, a court in an unpublished decision went the other way. It was the first decision in a federal court that I saw going the other way. I think it's an outliner. I think it should be repealed and reversed. As I say, it's just a district court, so obviously there's now differences of opinion in the court system, but the good law and the majority of courts and agencies that have looked at it have found going to the news media to be protected under the normal whistleblower statutes. All of that being said, going to the press as a whistleblower is always, in my view, a radical step, because you have a chain of command, and did you exhaust it? There are government agencies often designed to get the information. Did you use them? Going to the press will open you up to heightened scrutiny, and it will open you up to the types of leaks, to the types of counterpunch that you heard from our speakers that a whistleblower can expect. Going to the news media is often the very end of the line, not the beginning of the line. That doesn't mean in law there's a difference, but in reality there is. There's an important decision from the United States Department of Labor that is still good law within the Labor Department, and it analyzed whether going to the press should be protected in the private sector. As we say, under the First Amendment, it should be protected for government workers, but should it be protected in the private sector? And the analysis was this. A whistleblower who goes to the government with an allegation of wrongdoing is protected. What about a whistleblower who goes to the press? Should they be protected? And the statute is silent. The statute says going to the government is protected. And what the analysis was, how do you get the government to take an allegation seriously? How do you actually make change in the United States? How do you force a bureaucracy to be responsive? And the analysis was by going to the press. A politician or a bureaucrat may ignore allegations of a whistleblower for years, but when they hit the newspapers, they have to take it seriously, often. And that's what happened in that case we did in 1986. The issues raised at Savannah River had been raised for at least 2 years. This guy had been hammered down. The Department of Energy had originally thrown his case out. The Department of Energy had lobbied against him. I mean, looking at his case in 1986, he was a loser, because the contractor fired him and the local DOE office had slammed him down. But once the facts got out through the national news media and a new light was shed on it and pressure was put on the Secretary of Energy, it was all reopened, all reinvestigated. So it's clear, but had that whistleblower shown up to the Washington Post day one, there probably wouldn't even have been a story, because he wouldn't have had a track record to back it up. So I think the good law is going to the press is protected. But the reality of the law is it's risky. In the private sector, unfortunately, you can't say with a certainty anymore whether it's protected or not, although the good law says it is. In the government sector, it should be, but reality is very different. I also want to state that no whistleblower laws currently protect the disclosure of secret or classified information to an unauthorized source. So even though the First Amendment says freedom of speech, that does not mean that that gives a whistleblower immunity for violating other laws that may be in effect. That could also include in the private sector rules on confidential business information, secrecy agreements, non-disclosure agreements, etc. There's a host of landmines, especially when you're going to the press. Why? Because if you blow the whistle in a letter, say, to an auditor, no one may actually see the letter. Your managers may know you were protesting a certain safety practice, but they may not know exactly what you said. But if something goes in the press, they can read what you said. They can refer it to the security office. They can refer it to their lawyers on trademark secrets. And if your name's associated with it, you may just have signed your employment death warrant. So going to the press has a lot of downsides, a lot of difficulties, but also can be the way to vindication or actually get the change. The bottom line is there are legal protections if you need to go to the press or go to the press, and those have to be carefully studied and implemented on a case-by-case basis with a lot of review and care. Finally, I'd like to say, and all the journalists here meet this bill, but you have to work with a journalist that understands the 6 rules that Mr. Solomon talked about, that is professional, will understand what a whistleblower goes through in both the vetting process and in their own personal lives. And there are a lot of journalists that do that, and I'm honored to have 3 of them here. So that is the legal summary, and what we'll do is we'll now open it up for questions. I have a whole slew I've written out, but before I do it, I'm going to open it up to the floor. So, any questions?
Steve, when you were talking about Dr. Whitehurst and the FBI, and when you said push came to shove, you were able to get a sitting FBI agent with top secret clearance to be able to talk to the news media. What's missing from the discussion is the meetings that you had to have with your partners before that happened, where you had to go over the risk of whether you would still be practicing law when you were done with this process, and what would we do if push came to shove in the wrong light. So I think maybe when you talk to push comes to shove, you're not really putting the full deck of cards on the table of the risk factors that lawyers enter into when they deal with whistleblowing at the highest levels.
Okay, and I'll do that, and I think any of the panelists can respond. I'll respond first. In dealing with a whistleblower with high-level information, and you know the whistleblower has classified information, and you're trying to make sure no classified information is ever disclosed, everyone who's participating in that process has a risk. And I know Mr. Solomon has personally had some of those issues, and he can talk about them with some of the searches. But yeah, when you are standing up for a client, and that client is very controversial, not because they're a good or bad person, but the information they have is electric, is radioactive, and can cause change. There are risks both to everyone who's involved in that process, and it has to be weighed. And again, if you're a whistleblower, you need to partner up with lawyers and with journalists who are willing to take that risk. If they're not, they may abandon you in your time of need. On the other hand, it's the understanding and the respect for that risk that I think would lead to the caution necessary that you never have a disaster. And I'm just going to open up with those comments to the other panelists. If you'd like to say something from a journalist perspective or how you've worked on it.
About the risks
the risks not just of the whistleblower, but the risks that are implicit in a controversial story.
Excuse me. When you're dealing with classified information, it's always, that's the riskiest. That combined with an anonymous source who more than likely is not willing to go on camera or go public, because particularly with the Larry Franklin case and all of that, there is a separate national security law that you have to deal with, and so you proceed very slowly and cautiously, and generally what I've been able to do, and I'm sure it's true of everybody here, is that you take, it's like off-the-record information. You are not going to broadcast it or publish it, but you're going to use it as a lead to verify the nut of it, and in either unclassified way or with senior government officials who will in effect declassify it for you. And I know that that's happened to me in a couple of instances where somebody way down in the trenches leaked us something and couldn't go with it, and I worked my way up into the chain and got to a senior intel official, and then they completely laid it out for us, sometimes in the hope of getting us just to not run the story, but other times just to make sure we got it right. Because the other risk when you're dealing with classified information is, in the world of intelligence, in the world of espionage and all, it's so hard to get through the smoke and find the fire and realize if you're being manipulated, if you're being used, if it's the quality of the intelligence to begin with. It's all very tricky, and we spend a lot of time, months, year, 2 years, trying to verify things. So and the networks or the people who own the news business, they don't want to, if you're accused of violating national security, that affects the company's reputation. They care about that a lot, and if you get fined, they care about that a lot. So it's all, you really got to negotiate a very tricky road, but often you can. It just takes time.
John?
Yeah, I personally have endured a little bit of the legal consequences of reporting on national security and in some cases grand jury cases. In 2001, just before 9/11, the Justice Department took my home phone records and my work phone records, trying to figure out who I was talking to in a story about all of the things, all the ethical misdeeds that Robert Torricelli of New Jersey had engaged in at that time, and examining why he wasn't prosecuted in criminal court. And they got a judge to sign a subpoena, and they took my phone records trying to find out my sources. Fortunately, they didn't. I thought that was enough of a near-death experience that I'd had my one in life and I could move on. And 13 months later, the Bush administration, using a very arcane 19th century law called search and seizure authority at the border, took documents, non-classified documents that had been sent to me from a source in the Philippines, and held on to them. I never got my package. In fact, FedEx, who was delivering my package, was instructed by our government to lie to me and say that it fell off the package on a horse cart and we can't find it, we lost it, and they even paid me my $100 insurance money. But the FBI actually kept, without a warrant, my mail and tried to ascertain how I got it and why. And when we finally figured out what they had done and that the FedEx story was just a cover story, they sent 4 agents to apologize, which I always wondered, why did it take 4 agents to apologize? So there are consequences. I have not been as worried about the consequences to me as I am always cognizant of the consequences of anyone who comes to talk to me, because if I misidentify them, if I slip up even one time to someone who's listening or trying to figure out the identity of a source, I may have jeopardized an entire brave person's life. life. And so I think more than anything, I'm more cognizant of that. These two aberrations in my own career, I sort of just chalked up to some unusual behavior by the government. But there are consequences for us, but there are always consequences for the people who step forward. And that's the thing that always is front and center. And I know all three of our minds.
Jim, do you want to comment?
I don't have anything down.
Okay. Next question, please.
How do you deal with the keeping a story alive in the, when public opinion kind of moves on or public interest moves on? And it's a lot of times issues that whistleblowers are raising are, large problems that might take a long time to finally get a resolution, but public outrage can, change quicker than the problems get resolved.
Jim, we'll start with you on that one.
Well, I guess, I don't really look at it that way because I want to get the story out. I'm not so much, that has a kind of a tinge of maybe advocating for the person or the cause. So I haven't really had a situation where I've wanted to keep the fire burning for that reason. So I guess I can't really speak to that as a journalist. I don't know if you guys agree or
discuss that.
Yeah, I think Jim's right. Our role is not to be the advocacy role. Ours is to get the facts to the public, and then if there are no more facts to get to the public, to move on. So, but it is from I'm sure, a legal perspective and an advocacy perspective, a challenge.
Yeah, I would just say that if it's important, it's important, and you go for it and you look into it, and if by the time you get to proving it, the issue has moved on, there really is nothing you can do about it. If it's just not important anymore, either to your editors or to the public. I mean, you might, and I do, argue with my bosses, but I mean, if the practical reality is what was an issue in 2007 isn't an issue in 2009, you're not there to put the story on just to put the story on. You're just there to, report something that continues to be important.
I'd also like to state here, and part of our invitation list was to have 3 different types of journalists: news magazine, nightly news, and print. And in terms of the follow-up on a story, and this is something to always think about, because a whistleblower can establish a relationship with a journalist in a sense of the journalist becomes interested in the story. There's usually lots more to the story than is ever initially reported. But a magazine show like 60 Minutes, it's harder for them to do lots of follow-up because their format is as a news magazine, a 10, 15-minute feature piece. Nightly news is the same way. They have a very limited amount of time on a nightly news show to do a story, and a follow-up is very rare or much more difficult. Print, on the other hand, is your best chance of getting a follow-up because of the nature of the story, and also, I don't know, I hope my panelists here don't take offense to this, but at some point, it's almost like a baseball game, like a sporting, like who wins at the end. You have an issue, and there are people that will want to follow that issue all the way through to a conclusion. And print is the best way to do that from my perspective. It may come back into the electronic media if some big changing event happens, but print is the best way to follow up on it. And again, we have here 3 representatives from the national news media. I know some of them have roots in local news media, and often a story that was a national story at one point may become a local story because there's just a lot of interest in that local area. So it's just a question of how that story is moved.
Well, I would beg to differ slightly on that, and to protect my own parochial interest. And that is, I think sometimes, particularly a broadcast like 60 Minutes, which is the most watched broadcast in the country, it like a national newspaper, the Washington Post and New York Times, it can set the agenda, and we will put a story that might land on page A15 of a daily newspaper. We'll showcase it as one of the 3 on Sunday night, and like the Dick Clark story, like a number of stories I've done, it then gets picked up by the daily papers, and the daily papers may do the incremental follow-up that we won't do. But I mean, listen, if a whistleblower goes on camera and then suffers some serious retaliation, I mean, we'll be all over that, and there will be a follow-up story. But there also will be in the newspaper, and you know, there's sort of a symbiotic thing going on with print and TV. You know, I think particularly when you're dealing with the national broadcast media. So.
And he's 100% right. And I'll just going to tell a story from 60 Minutes as an example. We did a show, we worked with 60 Minutes on a show dealing with Sibel Edmonds, a translator from the FBI. And as part of that show, we just had one person on a 1-minute segment of it who was a unit chief who went on the show and said that what Sibel Edmonds was saying, she had credibility. Well, that unit chief got retaliated against immediately after the show. And 60, to its credit, rushed right in there and did a second show, like 2 weeks or 3 weeks later, on the retaliation of the witness. And then that triggered an inspector general investigation, and the assistant director who engaged in the retaliation was removed from his position. I think it's the only time that I know of at the FBI where a manager was actually removed from their position for retaliating against a whistleblower. That it explains from my perspective as a lawyer, you know, when a major media outlet does, in other words, it's one of the reasons why it's to a whistleblower's advantage, you know, takes on a case like Sibel Edmonds and explains what happened to her, and she also was vindicated by a full investigation. It is very dumb for an employer to then start retaliating against witnesses because thankfully, it's been my history with the press that the press doesn't like to see their sources getting slammed and will rally up. So I'm only talking in generalities. There will often be a good follow-up. So I hope that corrects the record. Another question, please?
Well, I have a question. Rich, when you were discussing Dick Clark, you mentioned that he was able to frame the debate, which is very unusual in many respects. A lot of whistleblowers don't really get to frame the debate. The media frames it for them. A prime example that I have was after 9/11, we had information that it was well known that the nuclear power facilities were at risk for airstrikes, and the federal government was covering up that fact. And we had leaked to us the information that demonstrated that, so something could happen to address the issue. And when we couldn't get anyone to take it seriously in the government and admit that they're lying to the federal, or at least tell us something that made us feel that the country was protected, we went to the media, and the media ended up running the story about how this document was found in the public records of the NRC, identifying that it was that the nuclear power plants weren't safe, and that Al-Qaeda could have gotten this. Well, the point of going to the media was to correct the problem, and afterwards what you had is the NRC closing down and shutting off any information that should legitimately be out there so people could really assess what was going on. And so that was like the exact opposite of being able to frame what was going on. And so I'm wondering, with Dick Clark, was there something in which he was able to do to frame the debate? Was it his level of sophistication? Did he have an attorney? Did he have a representative? Why was he able to frame it so successfully?
Because he's so damn smart. I think he anticipated everything that the White House would throw at him. I mean, I never had this discussion with him, but when they came after him, Dick seemed to be one step ahead of them, and so I just think he not only did what he felt he had to do, but he was smart enough to realize what the reaction would be, and he and he prepared himself for it. I mean, and the other thing that went on is that he and I knew each other for a long time before the piece ran, and it was clear that we had a meeting of the minds about what the piece would be. I mean, if he sat there and had one thesis and I had another thesis, I wouldn't lie to him about what my thesis was, and if it was at odds with his, he might well have gone elsewhere to do it, and I wouldn't have blamed him. For a piece like that, it's, you not only, after you satisfied yourself that the facts are there and that this person, is motivated for the right reasons, you develop a sense of identity with the source in this way, that you don't want to do anything that is going to hurt him. Ultimately he or she has to make their own decision, and if we don't see eye to eye on a piece, then I don't want him to do it with me. Then he should go and maybe somebody at the Washington Post or ABC will frame it in the way he did. But that was not an issue with us. So there's a lot of off-camera stuff. I mean, days, weeks, in which all of this is discussed, and he came to know intrinsically how I saw the story, and therefore the way he saw it is the way I saw it after a thorough investigation, and we went forward. So that's how he was able to frame it.
Would either of you?
Well, this is not strictly relevant to the question about framing, but Rich just brought up an interesting point. I often found that when you engage in this relationship and you go through, you do your due diligence, at a certain point, you really do become very closely associated with the whistleblower if you've done a story. And your credibility is on the line at the same time. I found in my own case, the organizations that I worked for liked the stories, but they wanted to make sure they were airtight. And if a serious challenge came to the story, I had to defend it almost as strongly as the whistleblower did. So that's why it was so important to do that work up front. You get intrinsically linked with your own whistleblower when you're doing these stories.
Well, and to elaborate on that, I'm sure lawyers go through this with their clients. I mean, when you meet somebody who is sharing all of this with you, like John said, I mean, you almost become a married couple, and if they're acting bravely and they're acting in the interest of a higher principle, you can't help but like them often. But at the same time, at the end of the day, you're a journalist, and you have a devotion to truth, and you have, quite honestly, a regard for your own career. And so you have to have this parallel set of relationships going on, where you may like the guy, and you may, want to, and you'll never want to do anything to hurt them, but you have to be ruthless about your pursuit of the facts and the truth. And when push comes to shove, for reasons of self-interest and because reasons of what got you into journalism in the first place, you go with the facts. And I mean, one of the classic examples, before my time at 60 Minutes, I forget his name now, some Vietnam-era colonel, I want to say Herbert, I don't know. He came to 60 Minutes with this unbelievable story. Mike Wallace and Barry Lando was the producer. And they went weeks and months going down one avenue about what the story would be. And at the end of the day, Barry Lando, the producer, realized that this guy that he had gotten to know and like was actually a fraud and was perpetrating a major fraud on the U.S. government and on 60 Minutes and the news media. And Barry turned the tables, and in the end, you know, his devotion was to the facts, to the truth. And so that, you know, I guess the point is, you know, you can like somebody, you can identify with somebody, but at the end of the day, it's got to check out, and we check it out ruthlessly, you know. Our devotion to the truth is ruthless, rather. So that's my elaboration there.
These guys summed it up perfect. I remember one little incident of a guy I'd written some stories about and gotten his side of the story about, and I always sensed there was something he hadn't told. I couldn't get it from anyone, and finally one day I found the flaw in his background, and I put it out there, and I remember how indignant he was. Well, how could you do that? Well, that's what we are. We're not friends at the end of the day. We're ultimately, you know, professionals, and we entrust it with the public's trust of getting the story completely. And if you didn't tell me something, and it's essential to the American public, you know, we're going to report it. We're not there to be your advocate. And I remember how angry he was. I would go home that night and I think, oh, that was a very powerful moment, screaming and yelling and calling me names. And but, you know, that's what we're entrusted with, and we really have to stay true to it. It's hard not to get attached to these whistleblowers, and you have to constantly keep pulling yourself back, constantly reminding yourself that even though in their humanity and what they're going through, your job is to stay as neutral and as honest and arbiter of the facts as you can be.
And I'm going to throw out a question to the panelists. I hope it's appropriate. I just would like each of them to respond to their view of protecting sources, even though under the U.S. constitutional interpretation, there's no First Amendment right to keep a source confidential. So therefore, you can be compelled through subpoena, grand jury, or civil subpoena to reveal a source. What's your personal view on that as a journalist, not just political, like how you deal with that in dealing with sources is what I'd like to know. I'm not looking for your, you know, we understand where the news media comes from as a matter of ideology, but I'm just looking for like how you personally deal with that when you're dealing with confidential sources. Whoever wants to take a jump.
I'll jump in here.
Sure.
My view on this changed over, you know, the 25 years I was a reporter. I used to think that that was kind of sacrosanct, and I'm not speaking from a personal point of view, but in terms of the law, that that sources really would have protection. But I saw that being abridged over the years, and obviously you look at, you know, during the Bush administration, what happened. A lot of reporters. I mean, John, that's a good example, and that's actually became, you know, almost typical in a way. The other thing that I saw is that corporations, these big corporations, especially when the economy started to go south, there was a lot of pressure. No one wanted a big lawsuit like that, and I saw the legal departments kind of waver a little bit. They weren't as steadfast as I wanted them to be. So I would enter into a relationship with a source or a whistleblower, and I'd kind of pepper that first conversation with a lot of caveats. I wouldn't, you know, toward the end of my career, journalism career, I wouldn't go in and say, you're going to be protected, I'm going to go to jail for y'all, you know, I'll die before I turn you over. I had to be more realistic about it and say, I will do everything in my power to protect you. However, there may be circumstances that come up where it's out of my control. And, you know, I thought about it. What would happen if, in my case, if NBC said, we're not going to back you? I didn't have, it wasn't contractual. And so I became much more guarded and careful about how I laid that out with my sources. Curious to hear what you guys say.
Jim's exactly right. And I'm reminded of the Matt Cooper case in the Scooter Libby case, where at the ultimate day, Time Warner made the decision to violate his source relationship when he still was willing to go to prison for it. And so it is a complicated circumstance. I changed my practices in the last decade, and limiting the number of people that you always vet with your immediate boss, your sources, so that they can ascertain the anonymous source. But I've limited the number of people that I've told that to increasingly to create fewer witnesses for any effort to try to find out who my sources are, and to avoid or try to avoid the circumstance where a corporate titan looking at the bottom line would just say, the heck with it, I'm giving up his source and because we don't have any more money. And when I became the executive editor of the Washington Times, I had inherited a very sensitive case involving National Security reporter Bill Gertz, and the government had spent 2.5 years trying to get his a confidential source on a story involving Chinese espionage. And, there were all these financial pressures on the paper, economy shrinking, recession shrinking. We fought that tooth and nail at enormous cost. I spent more defending Bill than I did on the entire rest of the news coverage in the course of a year, national news coverage. And we ultimately won a decision. It's the only decision in the last 10 years in which a judge has ruled that the First Amendment trumped the government's interest in a national security case. And but it came at enormous cost to the newspaper. We spent just enormous amounts of money, unbelievable amounts of money defending him, but it's worth it. And I hope as we get back to the basics of our journalism that we don't lose sight of that when we make that obligation, we really have to stick to it from the corporate titans all the way down to the original reporter.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, at what point are you willing to go to jail for a source? And, I rarely let it get to that, because I've been able to usually take somebody's information and then get it verified elsewhere. So it doesn't, so then my original tipster, who absolutely wants to remain anonymous, it becomes marginal to or irrelevant to what we ultimately put on the air. And and at the same time, I will not put that person's name anywhere on my computer. I won't put it on notes, anything like that, so that there's no way of it ever getting traced should the government come and attempt to seize my records. The only other thing I would add to it is sort of a twist on confidential sources. It came up once when I was doing a story about a medical researcher, whistleblower, who blew the whistle on a company that killed her research because it proved that the drug this pharmaceutical company was bankrolling was ineffective. And the company, I try to be even-handed. I talked to the whistleblower, and she was on the record for some, and she was on background and off the record for other stuff. And I felt like I didn't know what the facts were, because whistleblowers are complicated people, and you never know, and you want to hear the worst thing the other side has to say, so you can then backtrack it and figure it out. And at some point I went on background and off the record with the corporate executives, and at some point I realized what they were doing was completely trashing her in such a way that they had no obligation, no responsibility for anything they were telling me, but I was obligated to check it out and ask her about it, maybe, or call up people and get the rumor mill going. And so at a certain point I realized what they were doing, and then I just said, nothing's off the record, no more. And you just, and we just went forward. If you're not willing to say it on the record, then I'm not interested in hearing about it. So, I don't know, that was just a sort of a twist. It's sort of kind of the corporate version of the Scooter Libby use of confidential sources. So, anyway, okay.
It actually reminds me, in the context of whistleblowers, it is common for the employer to use off the record or background information to trash on the whistleblower, to try to get some traction against that employee. There are famous cases, for example, the Linda Tripp case, where they went into her security file, and as everyone knows, or not everyone knows, but it's common knowledge that if you're doing a security background check for a top secret clearance, they're going to gather up a lot of innuendo and nonsense in that file, so it's supposed to be very secret. Yet they went into it, just opened it up, tried to find embarrassing tidbits, and then leaked it out. There are other cases like that where the government itself that has tremendous access to information that can smear people go into their files and do the smear on the whistleblower. The Privacy Act, in fact, was enacted in 1976 because that is exactly what happened with Daniel Ellsberg, where the government went into certain classified government records just to obtain damaging information to smear him. It does cut both ways, and it's an issue that's out there.
I think there was a question in the...
Question?
Mr. Cohn, how have you been so successful in getting your whistleblowers cases into the media? How would a lawyer go about doing that?
You know, that was a question I was going to ask our friends in the media. In other words, what question that I have, and I don't really know the answer to that, but the question that I have to the panel is if there were like 2 or 3 things when a whistleblower comes forward initially, like to go from first, to get on first base. In other words, what are you looking at in a whistleblower that says this might be something that is worthy of a full investigation, or if you start the investigation, what are like those, the guideposts you're looking at? I don't know the answer. I was going to ask them, so thank you. I don't know if people want to do like just like your thumb rule on what you look at when a whistleblower who has some of those negatives that Jim mentioned, may have a lawsuit, may have issues with their employer. What do you look at in the initial vetting process to determine whether this might be a real case?
Well, I think it comes down to what you consider to be newsworthy, period. So if the whistleblower is coming to you with a story that's germane, it's in the news, obviously you're going to be more interested. I looked for people with high-level access, not someone on the kind of lower rungs. I loved to have any kind of documentation, or if they come to you with some instant corroboration, that helps immensely. And then it's some of it's just a gut check. You want to look someone in the eye and assess how credible they are, and then go through that whole process of trying to weed out people who are not credible up front.
I'm going to give away one of 60 Minute Secrets because I had the pleasure of working with them a couple years ago, and I was impressed beyond all belief at the effort that they go to check out the people that they're talking to. So one of Rich's colleagues is a guy named Ira Rosen, and he produces for Steve Croft, and we were doing the project on bullet lead analysis and the flaws in the FBI science. And I picked them up at the airport, and we're going to go down and meet this low-level FBI agent who may or may not know something about the case. And Ira and I are talking in the front, yucking it up, and I'm looking at the associate producer in the back, who's always a young, up-and-coming journalist, and she has this gigantic binder. It's 3.5, 4 inches thick, and I thought, well, maybe she's studying for law class or whatever. And I finally have to ask her, because the whole time she's silent, and I are yucking it up, and I look back, what is that? And he says, oh, this is everything I dug up on Agent X. And she had dug up everything to the point of knowing what favorite wines he had, and that he had been a wine taster earlier in life, and she knew things about his life and I watched in the course of that, when you're getting that gut check, when those two, when you're meeting the whistleblower for the first time, and the ability, the power of doing such thorough research that you could have a really engaging conversation with the person right away. Are you telling me the truth? I really know all these things about you. And when I saw that level of due diligence, I thought, wow, that is journalism at its best. And I think that that's an important part of what we have to do. And when you look at cases where the media got it somewhat wrong, they may have had some accurate facts, but they didn't precisely capture what really went on, it's because they haven't taken that due diligence that 60 Minutes does every time, or that NBC always did on Jim's watch. And I think that that's probably the most important thing. If you can talk to me, what was that, Rule 5, facts, we want facts, Rule 3, facts, whatever it is, we deal in the factual. And so what's been great about working with Steve over the years is he always comes to the table with facts. And other great lawyers that I work with, they know we need facts, and they know we need to be able to validate things. Don't tell me you think something happened, show me how I'm going to get there. And that's what builds that level of trust. And in the vetting process, it's checking facts. Every little I and T has to be dotted and crossed, and that's what grows the confidence level.
Yeah, well, Steve, you said you didn't know what we're looking for. I mean, and as Jim was saying, we don't know. It's all very situational. I mean, sometimes you'll a source or a whistleblower will come with something, and it is esoteric, or it just doesn't reach the threshold, and I don't know what the threshold is, it just depends on what's going on. It doesn't reach the threshold, but generally it's something that is, for us, of national consequence, maybe surprising you didn't know that, or makes you think about something you thought you knew, makes you think about it in a different way. And in terms of what the attorneys could do or what the whistleblowers can do, I mean, it's like John said, eventually we do an amazing amount of work. The glory for me of 60 Minutes, even after all these years, is I only do 4 or 5 stories a year, so I get to spend 2-3 months on a piece, and at the end of the day, we'll shoot 30 cassettes, which is 900 minutes, and we'll boil that down to 13 minutes. And that's because the amount of information we know that doesn't go into the piece is breathtaking. And parenthetically, we once used that as a way to get out of a threatened lawsuit. We said, well, this is what we haven't reported, and this will come out in court if you do sue us, and the lawsuit was dropped. But what a lawyer can do is know the story, know the case, and present it to us, and then it's just meeting the guy, eyeballing him or her, and getting a feel for them, looking into it, and finding out if it's everything he or she says, and if it holds up in terms of significance and interest level. But it's a very general. I mean, it's so general. It's you really. It's hard. It's difficult to make a hard and fast rule about it.
Thank you. Is there another question?
This may not be on subject, but it appears to me with the decline of newspapers, investigative reporting, the rise of cable TV, the whistleblower is in trouble.
Well, that's an excellent question. If our panelists want to talk about, yeah.
Arguably, yeah. It's with the diminished resources for investigative reporting is it's a real problem.
Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I have 2 theories. One, we're expensive investigative journalists. That's the first thing. Not because we get paid a lot of money, but we spend a lot of money going after things. But secondly, we're also almost as difficult as the whistleblower to deal with. So when the newspapers want to cut place, the first place that goes to those investigative journalists because they're really hard to deal with. But this is the thing that is really closest to my own personal interest right now, which has journalism in many ways in the name of saving money abandoned one of its greatest obligations to the public. And if you think about how this country started, it was things like Thomas Paine's pamphlets that rose an entire country up to fight tyranny and become a country itself. And yet today, so much of newspapers has become myopic. We either analyze what happened yesterday or we write about what we think is going to happen tomorrow. And so few people are trying to find out what really is going on because it takes time and it's hard. You've got to spend hours at a dinner table talking to a whistleblower that you may decide at the end of the night wasn't worth talking to because they want to tell you about the illegal parking going on in front of their house instead of something substantive. But it's something that we as a profession need to get a hold of. If I was going to write a book today, I think I'd entitle it Stop the Whining, Not the Presses. I mean, we've sort of convinced the public that we're not that worth that much to them anymore, and we've sort of ruined our own business model through our own professing of silliness. But I do really worry about this, and one of the things that we talked about the Packard Media Group, one of the things we're working on is to try to come up with a business model to support a robust investigative journalism. The place I'm at now, I'm a journalist in residence at the Center of Public Integrity. It's a nonprofit center that just spends money to do accountability journalism every day. And there's an outfit out of New York, ProPublica, that's doing the same thing. And it will be sad if investigative journalism has to transfer outside the profession to be sustained. But I'm glad some people are stepping forward. And my goal is within the profession is to try to convince editors and publishers and funders of media companies that investigative journalism, one, is essential to public discourse, and two, it can be profitable if done the right way. And I think that we need to, 3 great minds at this table here, 4 great minds at this table, need to figure out how we convince our bosses of that.
John and I were chuckling when Rich was talking about having months to work on a story because any news organization that's not, especially not a magazine, there's a constant pressure to churn it out. Investigative units are costly and they're time consuming, and the traditional models are probably will go away or really decline significantly. However, I'm not quite as downbeat about it, because there are all these other new models that are starting with the web. I mean, there's a guy I was reading about a while ago who has a notion that he's exploring now, where within local markets he kind of publicizes an area of inquiry and investigation, and then solicits donations from interested citizens. And it's kind of like a little microfinancing way on a local level to finance an investigation. It's not traditional, but if it works, fantastic. So I'm a little more optimistic. I think just the forms are going to change over the next couple of years.
Okay, given the time, I'm going to ask our panelists if they'd be so kind, if they have any concluding remarks that they want to share with the audience as we wrap it up. So I'm going to go in the reverse order. So I'll start with John, if there's anything you want to say in closing.
I just want to thank everyone for their time today. This is such an important aspect of democracy, being able to make sure that government and political leaders, business leaders are held accountable, and that their secrets can be brought to light when they need to be. So just the fact that we're having this conversation, I think, helps a lot to educate the public, and for C-SPAN to be here. There's a lot of important journalism to be done, a lot of important whistleblowing still to occur, and I hope that each member of the public and each person here today helps us engage in that, and we do some good. Thank you.
Jim?
I would just add that for any whistleblowers who are listening in, I hope they're not discouraged by some of the negatives that we pointed out today. I think we all have agreed that it's an incredibly important function, and some of the best stories that any of us have worked on.
Yeah, I would just say that in many ways, this kind of journalism is a blending of self-interest and public interest. I mean, the news organizations need to make a profit, but I know a broadcast like 60 Minutes and my colleagues there, I mean, we really want to do the right thing. We're really motivated to act in the public interest, and sometimes those corporate and journalistic ideals clash, but by and large, it shakes out well in the end, and it's like healthcare legislation. The process can be ugly, and the sausage making, but at the end of the day, all are served by it, personally and professionally, and whatever it is that's driving the whistleblower, and hopefully what's best for the country. So in light of that, I invite all whistleblowers to, beat the path to 60 Minutes. Thank you.
And in closing, what I'd like to add, and this is actually a message to the attorneys who will be representing whistleblowers and to the whistleblowers, which is, you've heard somewhat from the journalists today about what they're looking for or what they're weary of in terms of you're trying to get a message out that can effectuate change and not lose an opportunity to make positive change because of difficulties in communication. I think one important thing for journalists and lawyers to be very, very aware of in dealing with whistleblowers, as someone who's worked with them for over 25 years, a whistleblower normally is really two people. The person they were before they blew the whistle, which is often honest, courageous, superb employee that works their way up, loyal, just who you want on your team. And then the person that you will see, on the park bench or calling up late at night, frustrated, depressed, upset, because what they had believed in, and often their value structure, has now been turned topsy-turvy. But I will say that I've been able to see it from, I don't know the whistleblowers before they blew the whistle. I can only read it in their performance reviews or letters of commendation. They come to me when they're in crises, but I am able to see them after. And often they become back to the people they were. And it's amazing when you see them again as that loyal, dedicated, incredibly effective employee or activist or professional. Sometimes the press never sees that because the story's over, you know, but as an attorney who would have a long-term relationship with the whistleblower, we get to see it. And I hope that the crises that the whistleblower is in when they turn to the journalist doesn't become an impediment, but that is understood and